Chapter 2. Unexpected Meetings. His final approach to Sherborne was along the A30, having just passed through Yeovil. James decided he would park at the bottom of Digby Road. There were so many side streets around there, which he could easily duck into, and enough scope to have a few detours if he needed. He was not going to take any chances. From the car he could make out the large silhouette of the abbey at the top of the street. Founded in 705 AD by St Aldhelm, it had a much grander feel to it than its current position in the ecclesiastical hierarchy warranted. Once the episcopal seat of the Bishop of Wessex, the abbey was now just a parish church steeped in history, and home to one of the finest examples of fan vaulting anywhere in the country. James quietly exited the car, and after looking around to see if anybody was around, he quickly moved off up the street towards the abbey. Turning right, he went down into Pageant Gardens and followed the path which skirted the edge of the gardens, exiting opposite a supermarket on the far side. He turned left out of the garden and walked up South Street, carrying straight on at the second crossroads to continue up the steep incline of Cheap Street. Keeping close into the shadows created by all the shops, he walked past the Cross Keys Inn and Bellissima lingerie shop. Nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary so far. In fact, little had changed in the sleepy Dorset town since he had left the school. Nevertheless, he was not about to drop his guard, knowing all too well not to take any chances. Weaving his way along many small side streets and alleys, doubling back every now and again to ensure nobody was following him, he finally walked back down Cheap Street, before cutting up yet another narrow side street next to the Cross Keys. It was not much more than an alley, really, and was not well lit. He gave a slight shiver and adjusted the buttons on his black cloak as he crossed under a small stone arch high above his head. That arch had always made him think there was something sinister about the alley. Supposedly it had been used to hang many people during the bloody assizes in 1685 after the Monmouth Rebellion had been put down. The alley itself opened up at the southeast corner of the abbey. Just before reaching the abbey, there was a door set into the 10-foot high wall on the right that led through into the school grounds just below School House. Unfortunately, there was a code lock on the door, and even James's memory was not good enough to remember what the code had been. Besides, it had been most likely changed since his time. Luckily, the wall dropped in height to no more than 4 foot as it merged into the abbey. He had fond memories of vaulting it many times as a boy to escape the confines of the school, long after lights out, when all the boys should have been safely tucked up in bed. Checking to make sure that no one was around, he scrambled up over the wall and dropped lightly down into the school grounds on the other side. Sticking as closely as he could to the outside wall of the abbey to avoid the CCTV, he cautiously made his way along the stone paving towards an archway between the east wall of the abbey and the OSR. Skirting past the main entrance where the chronograph was inscribed above the doorway, he noticed a second inscription on a sign at the side of the entrance that he had forgotten about. The hint of an amused smile crossed his face as he read it. Hanc Sigaratanis Donna, sis vibibus urnam, atria qui fumans docta, viator ardis. Present this urn with your cigarette ends, if you please, visitor, you who approach these learned halls as a smoker. He slipped through the arch under where there was a side door at the corner of the OSR, which he had used many times as a boy to exit the house late at night when he wanted to sneak out without being caught. He knew from experience that this door was very poorly secured and was probably still used by boys to exit in much the same way. It was extremely convenient. It could be locked and unlocked from the outside if you knew the knack to it. He gently eased the 2 bolts on the inside back and quietly opened the door into the oak-panelled room, just as the abbey bells sounded 1:45. Inside were many boys' names that had been carved into the oak panels over the centuries. All around the room were stained glass windows which held the coats of arms of all the headmasters who had presided over the school. At the end of the room was a small Portland stone statue of the school's benefactor, Edward VI, who had granted the school its charter. It was this end of the room that James was interested in. When he had been a boy at the school, he had discovered that one of the panels at the end of the room had a lot more to offer than it seemed. If you pushed it into the wall, it could then be slid to the side to reveal an ancient set of steps descending beneath the room. Rebolting the oak door behind him, he softly made his way to the panel and put his weight against it until it gently gave a click, which echoed through the moonlit room. Waiting a few moments to make sure nobody had been disturbed by the noise, he slid the panel to the side, descended a few steps, turned and replaced the panel. The craftsman who had made it had the foresight to put handles on the reverse side of the oak panel so it could be easily removed again when one wanted to return. The pitch darkness enveloped him as the panel locked out the last shards of moonlight from the room above. Reaching into a pocket of his long cloak and fumbling around for a few seconds, he retrieved his phone and used it as torch to guide him along the underground network of passages below the school and the abbey. It was a strange feeling. Apart from the few times he had explored the network, these passages had never, to his knowledge, been walked in hundreds of years, if at all since their construction. The main tunnel had an eerie feel to it. Cobwebs were draped along the rough sandstone walls. The air smelt musty and damp. In a few places lichens had taken up residence where drops of groundwater seeped through and trickled down the bare rock. There were many twists and turns along the route, with a few side passages that led off it, passages that he had never explored fully. He knew that the main passage would take him to just underneath the far side of the school's library in the Undercroft, which was close enough to his final destination, a small grate in the corner of the fifth form green at the far side of the building. After a couple of minutes following the passage, he arrived at the grate and lifted it as slowly as he could. The grate obviously had not been operated in a while. The rusty iron hinges screeched as he forced it open, but he knew that the sound had not been loud enough for the school's security guards, known as the custos, to have heard. He cautiously climbed out, angling the grate up against the Portland stone wall of the Undercroft, deliberately leaving it open just in case he needed to make a quick exit. Checking his watch, he knew that he would not have to wait long, as it was already 01:53. His heart was racing. He had no fear, but instead was filled with excitement and perhaps a little apprehension at the prospect of reconnecting with someone he had not seen for a very long time. The only thing was that he had a little voice in the back of his head nagging at him that something did not feel right. It all seemed a little too easy. But then, should that not be the case? This was hardly an op in some hot, arid place where insurgents could appear at any moment. And where was the danger in two friends meeting, whatever the circumstances? So he dismissed it. Suddenly a slender black-clad figure loomed up over the large wall at the south end of the green and dropped nimbly down onto the grass. Then the little voice in his head began screaming at him. This was definitely not his friend. The person was too slight and far shorter than his old friend. Quickly turning on his heels, he was about to drop back down through the open grate and escape along the passage, when he heard a lady's voice. "Wait, ghost! Please, wait!" James stopped dead in his tracks. Only Chris had ever dared to call him that, and only on a very few rare occasions when he wanted to get James to listen to what he had to say. He had always known how to push James's buttons. There had never been an explanation as to why he'd started referring to James as Ghost. Chris just knew that James hated being likened to an apparition that had no place in this world or the next. James turned back on his heels slowly, giving himself a few moments to recover from the shock of hearing those words. His mind was racing. A torrent of questions were cascading through his head. Who was this person? How did she know that name? How had she known how to come to this place? What did she want? Was she friend or foe? Quietening his thoughts, he paused and raised his head to gaze at this newcomer. She was standing in the moonlight, dressed in black, lightweight clothing, which, it must be said, accentuated the shape of her body. Although slight, she was perfectly toned and well proportioned, with long dark hair flowing over her shoulders. If you've quite finished checking me out, I believe we've got a lot to discuss. My name's Rachel, she stated, with almost the hint of a smile. Chris told me to show you this, she said as she tossed a silver ring to him. Catching hold of it, James inspected the engraving, an identical twin to the one he was wearing. Chris sent his apologies, but unfortunately recent events have prevented him from being here in person. He asked me to be here in his place and give you a brief outline of what's going on. What? Yeah? What? James replied, startled by the voice interrupting his trail of thought. But I feel this is not the place for such conversations. If you don't mind, I'm going to skip the pleasantries. Follow me, please, and try to keep up. Pausing as he heard footsteps echoing down the cloisters. I think we've already lingered here too long. This way, quickly, he said, gesturing towards the open grate. He helped to lower her down into the passageway before dropping down behind her and closing the grate. They shrank back a little further into the darkness of the passageway so as not to be seen. He felt the warmth of her body close to him as they crouched in the cool darkness of the tight passage. His view was obstructed, but there were definitely two men talking in low voices above them. It was hard to overhear what was being said. Nevertheless, they were obviously annoyed that their quarry had managed to elude them. Whoever they were definitely not employees of the school. An indication that James was entering this particular game far later than he had thought. Recalling himself from his thoughts, he heard the echoes of the men's footsteps fading away into the shadows, and decided that they should be doing the same. Grabbing his new companion roughly by the arm, which caused her to let out a sudden gasp of shock, he headed off down the passageway, ignoring the fact that she had shaken herself free from his grasp. He smiled to himself and carried on down the passageway, aware that she was following behind. She's going to be a stubborn one, he thought. Chris always did know how to pick 'em. Making their exit from the passage back into the OSR and quickly replacing the panelling, they left the room the same way James had entered. Outside it had started to rain. Fat drops soon ran down both of their faces. Taking a more direct route to the car straight down Digby Road from the Abbey, deciding that speed rather than stealth was the better course of action, they soon reached the car. Leaving Sherburn, they headed southwest towards Devon. The journey that he planned was not that long, but he could tell that it was going to be awkward. His mind was now so full of questions that quite some time passed before he had ordered his thoughts and spoke. James pulled into a lay-by on the A3088 after passing Oval. "Give me a phone," he said bluntly, as he turned to face the girl sitting next to him in the car. "Why?" she replied, defiantly staring back at him, feeling slightly out of place at the sheer audacity of the men. "Those men found us very easily. One conclusion might be that they're tracking one of us, so give me your phone." "Are you suggesting that I'm not to be trusted? That I'm not who I claim to be?" "Quite frankly, yes. That's exactly what I'm suggesting. I'm not going to take any chances. Your phone, please." He snapped, holding out his hand, without breaking eye contact with her. Reluctantly, she handed it over to him. He removed the battery to access a SIM card. He put the SIM card in his jacket pocket, and the remaining parts of the phone he dropped out of the car window. He did the same with his own before restarting the car and continuing on down through the Wessex countryside towards his intended destination. This girl intrigued James, however she was foreign to him. She may hold her cousin's ring, or so she claimed, and yet how it came to have been entrusted to her was still open to intense scrutiny. Until that had been resolved, he would keep his own counsel as much as possible. "So are you going to tell me where we're going?" "Chris is expecting us by tomorrow night at the latest," she said, breaking the silence. Ignoring her question, he began to ask some probing questions of his own. "How is Chris? I don't think I've seen him since our last training assignment together at Senny Ridge, when he got that scar on the left side of his neck." "He's very well, although unless it's somehow moved, I think you'll find the scars on the right," Rachel replied, recognising that James was testing her knowledge of his old friend. "Well, it's good to know that he's okay. Now that I think about it, I believe it was on the right. It's been a while since I thought about it." "When did you meet him? I don't remember him ever mentioning a cousin." "About 4 years ago. My parents were both killed in a car crash, and not having any other relations, Chris sort of took me under his wing. I've been living at his ever since," she replied. "Is he still living in Mary Tavy? I've some fond memories at that place. Really nice spot in Dartmoor," James said, knowing full well that Chris had never lived in Mary Tavy. "You're probing again. I think you mean Peter Tavy. Still don't trust me, huh?" "Well, can you blame me? I've only got your word that he sent you. But so far I'm satisfied." "So are you going to tell me where we're going?" "Teal House. I have a few things in storage at the estate that I think may come in handy at some point," he replied, trying to limit the amount of information he gave out. It was early morning by the time they finally wound their way along the last few country lanes to Cateal. The sun was just starting to rise above the horizon, and the birds had already been tweeting amongst themselves for some time. Cateal House had been part of his family's holdings for a number of generations, and over the years had undergone extensive restoration work. Now restored, the great Tudor manor house stood proudly in the early morning sunlight. James pulled up in the courtyard of the great house, the gravel crunching underfoot as he exited the car. Instead of walking straight up to the main house, he walked off in the opposite direction, past the visitors' car park, and continued down a narrow lane towards a group of stone buildings that lined the roadside. "This place is stunning," Rachel exclaimed as she admired the Tudor architecture before following in his footsteps. "Yes, it is rather fine, isn't it? It's just a shame its splendour is tarnished slightly by the means used to hoard the fortunes required to maintain it," James replied, knowing full well the history behind the house. The fortunes amassed to construct and maintain the great house had largely been made through the draconian use of the feudal system, overtaxing peasant farmers during the Tudor period, and more recently exploitation of labour in the sugar plantations of the West Indies. It vexed him greatly that much of his family's wealth had been gained through the exploitation of what he considered to be the barbaric use of Negroes almost 2 centuries ago. Somehow he felt that he needed to atone for the past sins of his family at some point. Sins that in his eyes should never have been allowed to happen, and could never fully be forgiven. An indelible stain on the family's good name. James stopped just short of the end but one garage. Taking a bunch of keys out of his pocket and selecting one with a green fob that matched the colour of the doors, he unlocked the padlock and slid the doors back. As the doors slid back, the alarm in the building sounded. Walking into the garage, he located the alarm keypad on the left-hand wall. Quickly typing in the code, he disarmed the alarm with the alphanumeric keypad. He used the garage as a bit of a storage area of personal equipment, which he had acquired over the years. Some of it he'd had used on expeditions, and some was of a rather more questionable legal status. "Jesus, it's like an assassin's toy shop in here," Rachel cried out as she took in the sight of all the weapons neatly arranged in large metal cabinets spread throughout the garage. "Are those missiles real?" she said, pointing in disbelief at the open crate of FIM-92 Stinger missiles. "Yeah, I came across them in Paris a few years ago when I was on an op." "I knew you guys were good, but how the hell did you get them back here?" "I smuggled them back by boat with Chris's help. It's one of the benefits of the house's close proximity to the River Tamar. Direct access to the estuary at Plymouth and the English Channel enabled us to smuggle quite a lot of questionable equipment into the country over the years. Don't think we're going to need them today. Might be a bit OTT." "Just a bit," she said with a hint of nervousness in her laugh, as she hoped there would never come a day when they were required. A wry smile appeared at the corner of James's mouth. "This is only scratching the surface," he replied as he picked up a large black canvas bag from a row of hooks and began to fill it with ammo clips, handguns, a few grenades, some SA-80s, and a personal favourite of his, an FNP-90 machine gun. "Right, I think that'll do for now. I don't suppose you've got any phones stashed away somewhere amongst all this stuff? Someone broke my last one." "Point taken. I think there's a few iPhones knocking about somewhere over there. We had some left over from an op, so they should be clean," James replied, with a vague wave in the general direction of the far right-hand corner. After rummaging through several boxes stacked in the corner, Rachel eventually found a box containing 6 brand new iPhones. She took 2 out and, taking the SIM cards James had kept, inserted them into a converter that she found in the box to transfer the data across to the new SIM cards without the potential risk of contaminating the burner phones with the old ones. "I don't know about you, but I could do with a few hours kip at some point," he said, yawning. "Yeah, I wouldn't mind catching a few hours sleep, although this floor looks less than appealing. Don't worry, Princess. Sure there's some camp beds floating around somewhere," he said as he began to rummage around in the corner of the garage. "Aha! Found them. And some blankets. Bonus." Rachel let the Princess comment slide. She knew he only meant it in jest. James set them up along the inside wall of the garage, and they both crashed out for a few hours. Just over 2 hours later, James woke, and walking round to the next garage, slid the doors back. Inside was a green Range Rover, which he swapped with the battered 406 that he'd been driving. He loaded all the gear that he'd selected into the back of the Range Rover, before leaving the keys next to where Rachel was still fast asleep, with a note to say that she could find him down by the river when she woke. James headed off towards the quayside below. He hadn't been down there for a while. It was one of the places he liked to go and admire the view. The tranquility of just watching the ever-constant flow of the river passing by always took his mind off the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The sun slowly made its way over the sky, its rays split by the wavelets shattered into thousands of pinpricks dancing on the surface. The sound of the water gently lapping at the quayside was somehow soothing. He must have been more tired than he had thought, because he soon nodded off on one of the benches along the quay, listening to the stillness. James continued to sleep on the bench, absorbing the atmosphere. It was uncannily quiet, not that he really minded. Sometimes tranquility was all that he ever wished for. He had often wondered if somewhere there was a stopwatch that one could use to freeze time. Just pause everything around you so that one could be able to admire the little things. For instance, to see a dandelion just as it releases all of its seeds, floating away on the breeze. Or to pause the night sky just as a star is born. That one perfect moment when suddenly, out of the darkness, a dim light appears, growing ever brighter in strength as the reaction between particles increases until it becomes self-sustaining. A sudden cold gust snapped him back to reality, and with it the realization that nothing would be quite the same ever again. The atmosphere was changing. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck start to stand up. He shivered as though someone had just walked across his grave, and in that one moment, time did almost seem to stand still. He heard a loud roar as the V8 of his 4x4 burst into life, shattering the stillness. A screech of rubber on tarmac as it came to an abrupt halt next to him. "Get in!" she screamed at him. She opened the passenger door from the inside. "For God's sake, don't just sit there! Get in! We need to go! Now!" Guessing that they'd overstayed their welcome, he jumped up from the bench and swung himself through the open door into the passenger seat. "Go! Drive!" he exclaimed, slamming the door shut.